The nearly 300,000 Africans brought to the mainland colonies during the 18th century were not a single people. They came from different cultures, spoke different languages, and practiced many religions. Eventually, an African American people would emerge from the diverse groups transported to the British colonies in the Middle Passage. Slavery threw together individuals who would never otherwise have encountered one another, and who had never considered their color or residence on a single continent a source of identity or unity. Their bond was not kinship, language, or even race, but slavery itself. The process of creating a cohesive culture and community took many years, and it proceeded at different rates in different regions. But by the 19th century, slaves no longer identified themselves as Igbo, Ashanti, Yoruba, and so on, but as African Americans. In music, art, folklore, language, and religion, their cultural expressions emerged as a synthesis of African traditions, European elements, and new conditions in America. For most of the 18th century, the majority of American slaves were African by birth. Advertisements seeking information about runaways often described them by African origin: young Gambia Negro, new Banbara Negro fellow. Indeed, during the 18th century, black life in the colonies was re-Africanized as the earlier Creoles, slaves born in the New World, came to be outnumbered by large-scale importations from Africa. Compared with the earliest generation of slaves, the newcomers worked harder, died earlier, and had less access to freedom. Charles Hansford, a white Virginia blacksmith, noted in a 1753 poem that he had frequently heard slaves speak of their desire to re-enjoy life in Africa. I oft with pleasure have observed how they, their sultry country's worth, strive to display in broken language, how they praise their case and happiness when in their native place. How would they dangers court and pains endure if to their country they could get secure? No experience was more wrenching for African slaves in the colonies than the transition from traditional religions to Christianity. Islam had spread across North Africa and the region of the Sahara Desert. The slaves who ended up in British North America, however, came from the forest regions of West Africa, where traditional religions continued to be practiced. Although these religions varied as much as those on other continents, they shared some elements, especially belief in the presence of spiritual forces in nature and a close relationship between the sacred and secular worlds. West Africans, like Europeans, Equiano wrote, believed in a single creator of all things, who governs events on earth, but otherwise their religious beliefs seemed more similar to those of Native Americans than to Christianity. In West African religions, there was no hard and fast distinction between the secular and spiritual worlds. Nature was suffused with spirits, and the dead could influence the living. The spirits of departed friends or relations always attend them and guard them from the bad spirits of their foes. Although some slaves came to the colonies familiar with Christianity or Islam, the majority of North American slaves practiced traditional African religions well into the 18th century. Many Europeans deemed these practices superstition or even witchcraft. When they did adopt Protestant religious practices, many slaves melded them with traditional beliefs, adding the Christian God to their own pantheon of lesser spirits whom they continued to worship. By the mid-18th century, the three slave systems in British North America had produced distinct African American cultures. In the Chesapeake, because of a more healthful climate, the slave population began to reproduce itself by 1740, creating a more balanced sex ratio than in the 17th century and making possible the creation of family-centered slave communities. Because of the small size of most plantations and the large number of white yeoman farmers, slaves here were continuously exposed to white culture. They soon learned English, and many were swept up in the religious revivals known as the Great Awakening, discussed later in this chapter. In South Carolina and Georgia, two very different black societies emerged. On the rice plantations, slaves lived in extremely harsh conditions and had a low birth rate throughout the 18th century, making rice production dependent on continued slave imports from Africa. The slaves seldom came into contact with whites and enjoyed far more autonomy than elsewhere in the colonies. The larger structures of their lives were established by slavery, but they were able to create an African-based culture. They constructed African-style houses, chose African names for their children, and spoke Gullah, a language that mixed various African roots and was unintelligible to most whites. Despite a continuing slave trade in which young single males predominated, slaves slowly created families and communities that bridged generations. The experience of slaves who labored in Charleston and Savannah as servants and skilled workers was quite different. These assimilated more quickly into Euro-American culture, and sexual liaisons between white owners and slave women produced the beginnings of a class of free mulattoes. In the northern colonies, where slaves represented a smaller part of the population, dispersed in small holdings among the white population, a distinctive African-American culture developed more slowly. Living in close proximity to whites, slaves enjoyed more mobility and access to the mainstream of life than their counterparts farther south, but they had fewer opportunities to create stable family life or a cohesive community. The common threads that linked these regional African-American cultures were the experience of slavery and the desire for freedom. Throughout the 18th century, blacks risked their lives in efforts to resist enslavement. Colonial newspapers, especially in the southern colonies, were filled with advertisements for runaway slaves. Most fugitives were young African men who had arrived recently. In South Carolina and Georgia, they fled to Florida, to uninhabited coastal and river swamps, or to Charleston and Savannah, where they could pass for free. In the Chesapeake and Middle colonies, fugitive slaves tended to be familiar with white culture and therefore, as one advertisement put it, could pretend to be free. What Edward Trelawney, the colonial governor of Jamaica, called a dangerous spirit of liberty was widespread among the New World slaves. The 18th century's first slave uprising occurred in New York City in 1712, when a group of slaves set fire to houses on the outskirts of the city and killed the first 9 whites who arrived on the scene. Subsequently, 18 conspirators were executed. Some were tortured and burned alive in a public spectacle meant to intimidate the slave population. During the 1730s and 1740s, continuous warfare involving European empires and Indians opened the door to slave resistance. In 1731, a slave rebellion in Louisiana, where the French and Natchez Indians were at war, temporarily halted efforts to introduce the plantation system in that region. There were uprisings throughout the West Indies, including in the Virgin Islands owned by Denmark and on the French island of Guadeloupe. On Jamaica, a major British center of sugar production, communities of fugitive slaves known as Maroons waged outright warfare against British authorities until a treaty of 1739 recognized their freedom, in exchange for which they agreed to return future escapees. On the mainland, slaves seized the opportunity for rebellion offered by the War of Jenkins' Ear, which pitted England against Spain. In September 1739, a group of South Carolina slaves, most of them recently arrived from Congo, where some, it appears, had been soldiers, seized a store containing numerous weapons at the town of Stono. Beating drums to attract followers, the armed band marched southward toward Florida, burning houses and barns, killing whites they encountered, and shouting "Liberty." Florida's Spanish rulers offered liberty and protection to fugitives from the British colonies. The group eventually swelled to some 100 slaves. After a pitched battle with the colony's militia, the rebels were dispersed. The rebellion took the lives of more than 24 whites and as many as 200 slaves, including many who had no connection to the rebellion. Some slaves managed to reach Florida, where in 1740 they were armed by the Spanish to help repel an attack on St. Augustine by a force from Georgia. The Stono Rebellion led to a severe tightening of the South Carolina slave code and the temporary imposition of a prohibitive tax on imported slaves. In 1741, a panic, which some observers compared to the fear of witches in Salem in the 1690s, swept New York City. After a series of fires broke out, rumors spread that slaves, with some white allies, planned to burn part of the city, seize weapons, and either turn New York over to Spain or murder the white population. More than 150 blacks and 20 whites were arrested, and 34 alleged conspirators, including 4 white persons, were executed. Historians still disagree as to how extensive the plot was or whether it existed at all. But dramatic events like revolts, along with the constant stream of runaways, disproved the idea, voiced by the governor of South Carolina, that slaves had no notion of liberty. In 18th century America, dreams of freedom knew no racial boundary.